The Battle of the Allia was fought between the Senones, one of the Gallic tribes which had invaded northern Italy, and the Romans. It was fought at the confluence of the rivers Tiber and Allia, 11 Roman miles north of Rome. The Romans were routed and subsequently the Senones sacked Rome. The commonly date given for the battle is 390 BC. This is based on the account of the battle by the Roman historian Livy and the Varronian chronology, a Roman dating system. Following the ancient Greek historian Polybius, who used a Greek dating system instead, yields 387 6th BC. Tacitus said that the battle took place the 15 before the calends of August, which is the 18th of July. Background: the Senones were one of the various Gallic tribes which had recently invaded northern Italy. They settled on the Adriatic coast around where modern Rimini is. According to Livy, they were called to the Etruscan town of Clusium by Aruns, an influential young man of the city who wanted to take revenge against Lucamo, who had debauched his wife. When the Senones appeared, the Clusians felt threatened and asked Rome for help. The Romans sent the 3 sons of Marcus Fabius Ambustus, one of Rome's most powerful aristocrats, as ambassadors. They told the Gauls not to attack Clusium and that if they did, the Romans would fight to defend the town. They then asked to negotiate a peace. The Senones accepted a peace on condition that the Clusians would give them some land. There was a quarrel and a battle broke out. The Roman ambassadors joined in. One of them killed a Senon chieftain. This was a violation of the rule that ambassadors have to be neutral. The brothers had taken sides and in addition to that, one of them had killed a Senon. The Gauls withdrew to discuss what action to take. The Senones sent their own ambassadors to Rome, demanding that the 3 Fabii brothers be handed over to them. The Senate was pressured by favoritism not to express opinions against the powerful Fabia family. To avoid being blamed for a possible defeat if the Gauls attacked, they referred the matter to the people. Livy wrote that those whose punishment they were asked to decide were elected military tribunes with consular powers, heads of state, for the coming year. 36 The Gauls were enraged that those who had violated the law of nations had been honored and marched on Rome, which was 130 kilometers from Clusium. Livy wrote that, in response to the tumult caused by their swift advance, terrified cities rushed to arms and the country folk fled. But the Gauls signified by their shouts wherever they went that their destination was Rome. Size of the belligerent forces. The number of fighters involved in the battle is not known for sure. Plutarch said that the Romans were not outnumbered and had 40,000 men, but most were untrained and unaccustomed to weapons. Dionysius of Halicarnassus said that the Romans had 4 well-trained legions and a levy of untrained citizens which was larger in numbers. This would also give a rough figure of 40,000. Diodorus Siculus said that the Romans had 24,000 men. Livy did not give any figures. Modern historians Carey and Scullard estimate that the Romans had 15,000 men and the Gauls 30–70,000. Beres Fidelis gives an estimate of a minimum of 24,000 based on the assumption that the Romans had 4 legions, for each of consul had 2 legions under his command, and given that each legion had 6,000 men. He also thinks that there may have been a contingent of allied troop. He thinks that the Senones tribal army could scarcely more than 12,000. These figures for the size of the Roman army engaged in the battle are unlikely. For a start, ancient historians are notorious for exaggerating figures. Moreover, at the time Rome only had 2 legions. To do so, the Romans instituted the proconsulsh. The consuls were the 2 annually elected heads of the republic and the army. The proconsuls were consuls whose military command was extended so that more than 2 legions could be commanded. The first record of the practice of the consuls heading 2 legions is related to the Second Punic War, when Rome's territory and military manpower was much larger and she had to mobilize large numbers of legions to fend off Hannibal's invasion of Italy. Moreover, at this later time Rome also had 2 more types of military commanders, the praetors and the propraetors. The Battle of the Allia took place in the early days of Rome, at a time when the Roman army was much smaller and its command structure was much simpler. The 2 consuls were the sole military commanders and each headed 1 legion. In addition to this, the battle occurred during one of the periods in the history of early Rome when the consulship was replaced by military tribunes with consular powers, often referred to as consular tribunes. There were no consuls in that year. Therefore, Berifidala's assertion that the Romans at the Battle of Allia had 4 legions, 2 for each of the 2 consuls, is doubly anachronistic. In addition to the above, in the early days Rome was still a city-state of only regional significance and whose territory did not stretch beyond 30 miles from the city. Cornell notes that the estimates of the population of Rome in the late 6th century BC based on the size of her territory range between 25,000 and 50,000 and thinks that the more likely figure is 25–40,000. The seminal work by Fraccaro gives a pool of military manpower of 9,000 men of military age, which would require a minimum population 30,000. Archaeological evidence shows that in the 5th century BC there was an economic downturn. This would have precluded considerable population growth. The territory of Rome had increased by 75% by the early 4th century. But the bulk of this increase was due to the recent conquest of the city of Veii and her territory, and its population did not have Roman citizenship, which was a prerequisite for serving in the Roman army. These considerations make it unlikely that the size of the population of Roman citizens would have been big enough to provide a military pool of 24,000 or more soldiers at the time of the Battle of the Allia. The above gives sufficient reasons to doubt the figures given about the size of the Roman forces deployed at the Battle of Allia. In addition, it has to be noted that the Romans did not have much time to prepare for the battle properly, as after their embassy was rebuffed by the Romans, the Gauls immediately marched on Rome, which was only a few days' march away. The Roman army of that time was a part-time militia of peasant farmers which was levied for the military campaigning season and then returned to their farms. Not all men of military age were drafted every year. Some of the soldiers would have lived some distance from Rome and would have needed time to walk there. The size of the Senan force should not be overestimated either. The estimate given by Carian Scholada 30–70,000 is highly unlikely. Beres Fidelis rightly points out that his figure of 12,000 would have been quite large for a single tribe. The battle. There are only 2 ancient accounts which provide details of the battle. One is by Livy and the other is by Diodorus Siculus. According to Livy, in Rome no special measures were taken and the levy was not larger than had been usual in ordinary campaigns. The Gauls marched on Rome so quickly that Rome was thunderstruck by the swiftness at which they moved, which is shown both by the haste in mustering the army, as if it were meeting a spur-of-the-moment emergency, and the difficulty in getting any further than the 11th milestone. The Romans were greatly outnumbered. They did not set up camp or build a defensive rampart, and they did not divine the gods as they were supposed to. They extended the wings in order not to be outflanked, but this made their line thin and weak, and the center could hardly be kept together. They placed the reserves on a hill on the right. Brennus, the Senan chieftain, suspected that this was a ruse and that the reservists would attack him from the rear while he was fighting the Roman army in the plain. He therefore attacked the hill. The Romans panicked. The left wing threw away their arms down and fled to the bank of the river Tiber. The Gauls killed the soldiers who were blocking each other's path in the disorderly flight. Those who could not swim or were weak were weighed down by their armor and drowned. Still, the majority of these men reached Very, an Etruscan city which had recently been conquered by Rome and which was near the other bank. They did not even send a messenger to warn Rome. The right wing, which was further from the river and closer to the hill, instead fled to Rome. The Gauls were surprised about how easy their victory had been. The ancient Greek historian Diodorus Siculus said the Romans marched and crossed the river Tiber. He is the only ancient historian who placed the battle on the right bank of the river. They lined up their best troops, 24,000 men, in the plain and placed the weakest troops in the hill. The Celts also lined up and placed their best men on the hill and easily won the clash on that hill. The bulk of the Roman soldiers in the plain fled to the river in a disorderly manner and impeded each other. The Celts killed the men in the rear. Some Romans tried to cross the river wearing their armor which, according to Diodorus, they prized more than their lives. But this weighed him down. Some drowned and some managed to reach the bank further downstream with great effort. As the Gauls kept killing the Romans, the soldiers then threw their arms away and swam across the river. The Gauls threw javelins at them. Most of the survivors fled to the city of Very. Some returned to Rome and reported that the army had been destroyed. Plutarch said that the Romans did encamp and that the Gauls fell upon them. There was a disorderly and shameful battle. The Roman left wing was pushed into the river and destroyed, while the right wing withdrew before the Gauls' attack on the plain. The center escaped to Very. Aftermath: the sack of Rome. This is the account of the sack of Rome by Livy. The inhabitants of the city of Rome did not know about the soldiers who fled to Very and thought that the only survivors were those who fled back to Rome and that they had only a tiny force. There was panic. The Senones reached Rome, saw that the city walls were not manned and encamped for the night. The Romans sent the young men who could fight to defend the fortress of the Capitoline Hill. Most people fled to a hill near Rome, other towns or the countryside. The priests and the Vestal priestesses left the city taking the religious relics with them. A plebeian, Lucius Albinus, who was leaving the city, saw the Vestals walking and gave them a lift to Caere on his cart. The elderly remained in the city. The Senones entered the city through an open gate and went to look for loot. The noble elders stayed in their homes and left their doors open. A Gaul pulled the beard of one of the elders, who struck him with his ivory staff. The Senones then killed all the noble elders and ransacked and burnt their houses. After a few days the Senones attacked the Capitoline Hill, but could not take it. They decided to lay a siege. They sent some of their men to the countryside to pillage for food. Some Gauls approached the town of Ardea, where Camillus, a great Roman military commander, had been set to in exile because of accusations of embezzlement. Camillus organized the inhabitants into a fighting force and attacked the Gallic camp. The fight continued near another town, Antium, whose inhabitants joined in. This was the beginning of the Roman fight back. In the meantime, the survivors of the battle who had fled to Very began to regroup and defeated bands of Etruscan raiders who were looting the territory of Very. They chose Quintus Caedicius, a centurion, as their leader. Caedicius' forces grew. Some Romans who had fled the city went to Very. Volunteers from Latium also joined the force in the city. Caedicius decided to summon Marius Furius Camillus. However, the approval of the Senate was needed to have him as the commander. A messenger was sent to Rome. He climbed up to the Capitoline Hill unseen. The Senate decreed that the popular assembly was to recall Camillus and appoint him dictator. Camillus was escorted from Ardea to Very. The Senones found footprints that the messenger had left by the Capitoline Hill and found out about a tract which could be climbed. They reached the summit at night and were not heard by the guards and the dogs. However, the geese sacred to Juno did and alerted the Romans. Manlio Capitolinus, a former consul, rallied his men and pushed the Gauls back down the hill. Manlius was praised and one of the guards was thrown from the cliff for the negligence. Meanwhile, a pestilence broke out among the Senones. It was caused by diseased cattle, which they cremated because they did not have the energy to bury them. This led to a truce. The Gauls intimated the starving Romans to surrender. The Roman leaders, who were waiting for the army gathered at Veii, refused. However, the exhausted men of the Capitoline Hill pleaded for peace negotiations. The Gauls agreed to leave in return for a ransom of 1,000 pounds of gold. The Senones cheated using heavier weights to weigh the gold. When the Romans protested, Brennus, the leader of the Senones, tossed his sword on the scale, uttering words intolerable to the Roman ears. Woe to the vanquished! Paying off the Senones to leave the city was a humiliation for the Romans. However, as Livy put it, God and man forbade the Romans to be a ransomed people, before the weighing of the gold had been completed. Camillus reached Rome and ordered the gold not to be taken away. The Gauls said that an agreement had been made, but Camillus said that it had been struck by an official of lesser status than him and therefore invalid, but then offered battle, and the Senones were easily defeated. They were defeated again 8 miles to the east of Rome. Livy wrote, "The slaughter was total. Their camp was captured and not even the messenger survived to report the disaster." In the account of Diodorus Siculus, which is much less detailed, the Senones spent the first day after the battle by the Allia cutting off the heads, which he claimed was their custom. They then encamped by the city for 2 days. Meanwhile, the despairing inhabitants of Rome thought that the whole army had been wiped out and that there was no chance of resistance. They fled to other towns. The leaders of the city ordered that food, gold, silver, and other possessions be taken to the Capitoline Hill and fortified it. The Senones thought that the noise in the city meant that a trap was being prepared. However, on the 4th day they broke down the city gates and pillaged the city. They did not hurt any civilians and suffered many casualties. Finding that they could not take the city by force, they decided to lay a siege. Meanwhile, those who fled to Veii put to flight an Etruscan army which had entered the Roman territory around Veii and captured prisoners and booty. The Roman soldiers who had fled to Veii ambushed them, put them to flight and seized their weapons. They also recruited men from the countryside. According to Diodorus, their leader was Cominius Pontius. He sent a messenger to Rome to inform the city about these developments. The Romans were told that the men in Veii were waiting for an opportunity to attack. There is no mention of Camillus. The episode of the geese Juno and Manlius Capitolinus is mentioned. It is at this point that the Romans decided to negotiate a peace and persuaded the Senones to leave in return for gold. Most of the houses in Rome had been burnt and most of its people had been killed. The accounts of the Battle of the Allia and the sack of Rome were written centuries after the events and their reliability is questionable. This may also account for the discrepancies between Livy and Diodorus Siculus with regard to the sack of the city. The rescue of the city by Camillus is seen by many modern historians as an artificial addition to the story. It was not mentioned by Diodorus Siculus, and Camillus was never mentioned by Polybius, another ancient Greek historian. Diodorus said that the Gauls were defeated at the Trausian plain by an Etruscan army when they were on the way back from southern Italy. Strabo also says that they were defeated by Caera, which also recovered Rome's ransomed gold. Plutarch mentions that Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, said that Rome was saved by a certain Lucius. This could be the Lucius Albinus who was said to have given the priestesses a lift to Caera. The role that Caera in the saga of the Gallic sack is unclear, and it may be that this city played a bigger role than the one given in the Roman tradition. There is also the question of what the Senones were doing in central Italy. The ancient writers said that they were attracted by fertile lands. However, according to Cornell, this is unconvincing. Through the story, the Senones appear like a warrior band. There is no mention in any of the accounts of wives and children. Who would have been present if these Gauls would have been a migrating people in search for land? Cornell thinks that they were mercenaries. A few months after the sack of Rome, Dionysius of Syracuse, the tyrant of the Greek city of Syracuse, in Sicily, hired Gaul mercenaries for a war in the south of Italy. It may well be that the Senones were on their way to the south because of this. The story of their defeat when they were on their way back from the south also seems to fit with this hypothesis. It could also be that the Senones went to Clusium because hired by one of two political factions at loggerheads to intervene in political struggles in this city, rather than the romanticized story of Arun's revenge for his wife.